Welcome to Purbright Files, solving secrets behind every crime.
It was a golden afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the sort of afternoon when the roses hung heavy with bloom and the air was warm enough to tempt even the most diligent gardener to linger idly over tea. The annual summer fete had filled the vicarage garden with chatter, children's laughter, and the cheerful bustle of neighbours exchanging small talk. Beneath the striped marquees, plates of sponge cake and jam tarts were dispensed with brisk smiles. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of a lilac tree, her lace-gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She was, to all appearances, a quiet old lady enjoying the sunshine, though her mild blue eyes missed nothing. She observed the flushed excitement on Clara Atwell's young face as she leaned toward Peter Carmichael, home from university with an air of self-importance. She noticed the careful courtesy between Mrs. Bletchley and the widow Marchmont, each woman smiling with precisely the degree of politeness required, no more. And she watched Mr. Owen Cresswell, the new librarian, moving nervously among the guests. The library was the day's main topic of discussion. Once neglected and half forgotten, the 17th-century building had been reopened under Mr. Cresswell's management. He had taken to his post with great energy, sorting dusty archives and restoring the old reading room. Yet stories had begun to circulate, lights seen after midnight, noises when the place should have been empty, and books moved or mysteriously misplaced. A haunted library, some said, and the suggestion, though dismissed by the sensible, lent spice to the gossip. Miss Marple listened without comment. She knew from long experience that such stories usually had a simpler explanation than ghosts, though never, she reflected, a harmless one. Human beings could be quite as troublesome as spectres, if not more. The raffle was announced. Mr. Cresswell stepped forward, cheeks flushed with sun and exertion, to draw the winning ticket. His voice rang out as he read the number, and a ripple of amusement passed through the crowd when Mrs. Bantry's name was called. She stepped up to claim her prize, a wicker hamper full of preserves and wine, remarking in an undertone that she would have preferred a set of gardening gloves. All seemed well. Laughter, chatter, the clinking of teacups. It was precisely in such moments of village gaiety, Miss Marple reflected, that the shadows of something darker often crept in. Clara Atwell appeared suddenly at Mr. Cresswell's side, her face pale and her hands trembling. She clutched a slip of paper, crumpled and smudged, which she said she had found tucked between the pages of an old parish register, displayed at the library's booth. Mr. Cresswell frowned and unfolded it, his lips tightening as he read. His ruddy complexion drained of colour, leaving him ashen. The guests, curious and restless, pressed forward. He muttered about a childish prank and crumpled the paper in his hand, but not before several had seen the words written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. "The truth lies in the library. Blood upon the books, and one among you will not live to tell it." Uneasy laughter followed. Someone made a brittle joke about ghosts and mischief-makers, but the merriment did not return. People glanced at one another with nervous eyes, as though suspecting secrets in every familiar face. Miss Marple did not laugh. She watched Mr. Cresswell's shaking hand, Clara's frightened expression, and the silence that spread like a shadow across the garden. She had seen such things before. There was a particular way ordinary men and women behaved when the possibility of death brushed close to them, and that look was in their eyes now. No body had yet been found. No crime had yet been committed. Yet Miss Marple felt certain, as the note still crumpled in Mr. Cresswell's fist, that one would be before long. The news of the note spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of a summer breeze rustling through hedgerows. By evening, scarcely a household remained unaware of the strange words discovered at the fete. Some dismissed it with scorn, others repeated the tale with relish, but all found their imaginations tinged with unease. At the Blue Boar Inn, the village's modest public house, Mr. Barnes, the landlord, shook his head as he wiped a glass. "Some silly prank, that's all it is," he declared. "Children, most like, or some young rascal wanting to frighten the ladies." But he did not sound entirely convinced, and his wife, bustling about with trays of bread and cheese, muttered that children did not write in such a hand, nor choose such ominous words. Mrs. Price Ridley, who never failed to insert herself into every notable happening, insisted that the library was to blame. "A dreadful place," she told her circle of friends with an air of certainty. "Too old by half. Dust, cobwebs, and who knows what secrets shut away there. Mark my words, these things cling to buildings, and when you start disturbing them, mischief follows." In the grocer's shop, the talk ran differently. Mr. Abbott, who prided himself on being a practical man, suggested that the new librarian might have invented the note himself to stir up attention. "He's ambitious, that one," Abbott said, weighing out sugar into a paper bag. "Always talking about catalogues and restorations. A haunted library would bring folk in, wouldn't it? Just the sort of trick a young fellow might play." Meanwhile, Clara Atwell was spoken of with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. Poor girl, to have been the one to stumble upon such a horrid message. Yet her pale face and trembling hands were remembered by all who had seen her, and some whispered that she might have been more than a messenger. Young ladies, after all, could be fanciful, and it was not impossible that she had written the note herself for reasons unknown. Miss Marple, seated in her neat cottage parlour that evening, let the talk reach her through the usual channels. Gossip came to her without effort, as bees find their way to nectar. She listened quietly, offering no opinions, only the occasional mild "dear me" or "how very curious." It was remarkable, she thought, how readily people revealed more than they intended when faced with the appearance of disinterest. She considered what she had observed at the fete. Mr. Cresswell's reaction to the note had been genuine enough. His face had lost all colour, and his hand had trembled, not the look of a man playing a part for publicity. Clara, too, had seemed sincerely frightened, and yet sincerity was not proof of innocence. Many people were sincerely frightened of discovery. Elsewhere, the widow Marchmont entertained her niece, a bright-eyed young woman visiting from London. Over tea she spoke in hushed tones about the matter. "It is just as I said years ago," she confided. "That library has always had an atmosphere. My late husband would not set foot in it after dusk. He said the place had secrets best left buried." The niece, who was fond of detective novels, encouraged her aunt eagerly, asking for every detail. At the same time, Mrs. Bletchley was telling anyone who would listen that she had once seen a figure in the library window at night, long before Mr. Cresswell had taken up his post. "Tall, dark, and watching," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I told the constable then, but he said it was nonsense. Well, what do you think now?" The library itself, silent and old, sat at the heart of these conversations, like a brooding character in its own right. Its shelves of vellum-bound volumes, its shadowed corners, its faint smell of dust and age, all became magnified in the minds of villagers as they recounted tales of odd happenings. A draught where no door was open, a book displaced from its shelf, a sound of footsteps after dark. Miss Marple thought of human nature. People liked their mysteries and their hauntings, but behind every superstition there was a hand, a motive, and often a grievance. Libraries, after all, contained more than books. They contained records, parish registers, wills, letters tucked between pages, evidence of old quarrels. She wondered what secrets might have been stirred by Mr. Cresswell's eager cataloguing. By the second evening, speculation had grown so elaborate that it was difficult to separate fact from invention. Some said the note had been written in blood, others that it had been discovered pinned to a book of sermons rather than slipped inside. But beneath the exaggerations, Miss Marple felt the stirrings of something real. A genuine anxiety had taken hold of the village. Neighbours eyed one another with new suspicion, wondering who among them might have cause to write such a message. The constable, when pressed, assured everyone that it was likely nothing at all. He promised to keep an eye on the matter and advised calm. But few were reassured. After all, the words had been clear: blood upon the books, and one among you will not live to tell it. Miss Marple sat that night by her window, the knitting needles steady in her hands. Outside, the village settled into darkness. Lamps were extinguished one by one, and the church clock struck the hour. She thought again of the people she had observed at the fete, of the shifting glances and small hesitations. Each gesture, each nervous laugh was filed away in her mind, as neatly as Mr. Cresswell filed his books. She had no doubt at all that the note was not a prank. Someone in St. Mary Mead had written it with purpose. Someone had meant every word, and before very long, she suspected, those words would prove true. The storm broke late in the evening, sweeping across St. Mary Mead with sudden violence. Wind rattled shutters and drove rain against the windows in relentless sheets. The village lanes, so tranquil by day, were now half flooded, their cobblestones gleaming under the flickering lamps. People spoke afterwards of how strange the night had felt, how the air had carried an unease that was not entirely due to the weather. In the library, its mullioned windows shuddering against the gale, a light burned longer than usual. Several villagers glancing out into the rain noticed it. Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on vigilance, told her maid she was certain she had seen a figure crossing behind the leaded panes. At the Blue Boar, a late drinking guest remarked upon the oddity of it. The library lit past midnight when Mr. Cresswell was said to have gone home hours earlier. Yet no one ventured into the storm to investigate. By morning the tempest had passed, leaving branches strewn across gardens and puddles glittering in the lanes. The air was clean and sharp, though the village carried an odd hush as if waiting for something to be revealed. It was Mr. Abbott, the grocer, who discovered it. He had come early to deliver a parcel to the librarian. Finding the library door unlocked, he stepped inside with a muttered complaint about careless habits. The silence struck him at once, heavy and oppressive. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and old paper, tinged with something metallic. He advanced cautiously down the central aisle, his shoes squeaking on the damp flagstones. And there, in the dim light filtering through the high windows, he saw it. A body sprawled on the floor between the tall oak shelves. The figure lay face downward, one arm stretched outward as if reaching, the other bent beneath. A book, its leather binding darkened by smears, rested just beyond the hand. Mr. Abbott gave a strangled cry and fled into the street, summoning the first passer-by. Within half an hour, the library was crowded with people, neighbours, constable, and a visibly shaken Mr. Cresswell. The victim was revealed to be Harold Marchmont, nephew to the widow Marchmont, a young man who had returned to the village only recently. He was known for his restless temperament and his tendency to gamble, qualities which had already set tongues wagging since his arrival. Now he lay motionless among the books, his life ended in the quiet of the old library. The constable, red-faced and flustered, attempted to clear the room. He knelt by the body, muttering about needing the doctor. The book clutched near Harold's hand was retrieved, a parish register, bound in cracked leather, its edges marked with damp smears. Several pages were torn as though ripped hastily, and on one margin a blot of ink, fresh and smeared, seemed out of place in such an ancient volume. "Robbery," suggested Mr. Abbott, who had pushed forward again despite his fright. The poor fellow surprised a thief, but Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the room, doubted it. Harold's pockets, when checked, still contained his watch and purse. Nothing obvious had been stolen, and yet something had clearly been sought. The torn pages told their own tale. Mrs. Bletchley, arriving breathless, declared she had heard footsteps outside her cottage in the small hours. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had seen a tall shadow move in the library window. These testimonies only deepened the sense of menace. A haunted library, some whispered now with fearful conviction, had claimed a life at last. Mr. Cresswell appeared distraught, wringing his hands and stammering explanations. He swore he had locked the library before the storm grew heavy. He had gone home by 10, leaving everything in order. "I can't understand it," he repeated. "I can't understand how the door was opened." Clara Atwell, pale and shaken, clung to Peter Carmichael's arm. She confessed she had seen Harold Marchmont at the fete 2 days before, speaking with Mr. Cresswell in hushed, urgent tones. No one had caught their words, but Harold's expression had been sharp, almost threatening. The constable, seeking simplicity, suggested that Harold had returned in search of some old document, perhaps drunk or distraught, and that the storm had brought on an accident. He might have slipped, struck his head and fallen. The doctor, when summoned, confirmed a blow to the skull. But whether it was the result of a fall or of deliberate violence, he could not at once determine. Still, a strange silence lingered over the group as they stood among the shelves. The torn pages, the smears of ink, the unlocked door, all refused to fit neatly into the idea of a simple accident. Miss Marple looked about her, her eyes resting on each detail. The position of the body, the reach of the outstretched hand, the register lying just beyond. She noted how the villagers spoke, each betraying more than they intended. Clara's nervous tremor, Mr. Creswell stammering, Mrs. Bletchley's eagerness to confirm her own long-held suspicions. Human nature, she thought. It was always there behind the veil of chance or tragedy. And in the stillness of the library, heavy with the scent of dust and age, she felt the certainty of it. Harold Marchmont had not died by accident, and so the words of the mysterious note, read aloud at the fete, had proven dreadfully true. There was blood upon the books now, and a life extinguished in the very heart of the haunted library. The village awoke to the news with a shock that reverberated through every lane and cottage. By breakfast time, the death of Harold Marchmont was no longer a private tragedy, but a public drama, discussed over teapots, at garden gates, and in the queue at the grocer's. The air of unease that had hung about the fete had hardened now into fear. Someone in St. Mary Mead was capable of murder. The constable, encouraged by the anxious need for order, wasted little time in forming his conclusions. By mid-morning he had declared that the matter was practically solved. Harold Marchmont, he explained, had been in some form of quarrel with Owen Creswell, the librarian. Several villagers recalled seeing the two in earnest conversation during the fete, and Clara Atwell's trembling recollection of their argument was repeated with emphasis. The constable added with a certain satisfaction that Mr. Creswell had been the last person known to be responsible for locking the library. The door found unfastened suggested negligence at best and worse at worst. When word of these suspicions spread, it was received with both eagerness and dismay. Many were quick to nod that yes, Mr. Creswell had always seemed rather too intense about his books, too eager, too nervous. Mrs. Price Ridley recounted with relish how he had once snubbed her suggestion of a lending club for novels, insisting the library was for more serious scholarship. Such hauteur, she said, spoke volumes of his character. The others, however, were troubled. Clara Atwell defended him tearfully, insisting he was incapable of violence. Peter Carmichael added that Mr. Creswell was simply a man devoted to his work, nothing more. But their words sounded to some like the loyalty of youth, too soft-hearted to face the truth. The constable himself appeared gratified by the ease with which a suspect presented itself. He spoke of consulting the inspector at Much Benham, but hinted that there would be no need for complicated inquiries. An open and shut case, he said, and Mrs. Bantry, though privately doubtful, did not challenge him. Miss Marple, however, was not so satisfied. She sat quietly during the constable's pronouncements, her hands folded upon her lap, her eyes mild and unassuming. Yet she noticed how Mr. Creswell's distress, though genuine, bore a curious quality. He wrung his hands, yes, and stammered, but his fear seemed less of punishment than of something hidden being uncovered. It was the look, Miss Marple thought, not of guilt over murder, but of dread that some secret might be dragged into daylight. She thought, too, of Harold Marchmont himself, a young man of restless habits, whose reputation for gambling and debts had already stirred whispers. What business had brought him to the library in the dead of night, clutching a parish register? It did not align with the notion of a quarrel over books. There was something behind it, an old record, a hidden truth perhaps that Harold had sought, and someone else, determined to prevent its discovery, had met him there. The torn pages weighed heavily in her mind. Such deliberate destruction was no accident, and yet the constable paid them little attention, preferring to build his theory upon the visible quarrel and the unlocked door. Meanwhile, the villagers' tongues wagged freely. Mrs. Bletchley recalled how she had once seen Mr. Creswell leaving the library with a stack of papers under, his arm long after closing hours. Mrs. Price Ridley added that she had always thought there was something not quite right about a young man so devoted to dusty old volumes. The Blue Boar became the hub of speculation, with Mr. Abbott pronouncing that the librarian was surely hiding something valuable in those archives, and that Harold had stumbled upon it. In the midst of these confident assertions, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry, sipping tea. "It does seem clear enough, does it not?" Mrs. Bantry said, her brow furrowed. "If they quarrelled and then Harold is found dead in the library, it follows." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently. "Yet I cannot help but think of young Tommy Legg, who once quarrelled most bitterly with his brother over the allotments. Everyone said at the time that Tommy must have been the one who broke the greenhouse windows in revenge. Yet it proved to be the baker's boy, who only wished for the cucumbers. Things are not always as simple as they seem, dear." Mrs. Bantry gave her a startled look, half amused, half thoughtful. She had learned over many years of friendship that Miss Marple's seemingly innocent reminiscences were rarely without pointed meaning. As evening fell, Mr. Cresswell was summoned for questioning. He protested his innocence passionately, insisting he had gone home before the storm broke, locking the doors behind him. He admitted to having argued with Harold, but described it as a mere dispute over access to certain archives Harold had requested. He was most insistent, Mr. Cresswell said, but the records he wanted were in a state not yet fit for handling. I told him so, and he became quite heated. That was all. The constable, unimpressed, pressed him harder. His fluster only grew, and in the eyes of many it looked like guilt. Miss Marple, listening to the account, noted again the detail. Harold had been seeking records. That explained the torn pages, the parish register in his hand. It was not a matter of random violence nor of scholarly quarrels, but of something hidden in those pages, something someone had a reason to suppress. By the close of the day, suspicion rested squarely upon Owen Cresswell. The village, with its need for certainty, seemed almost relieved to have the matter settled. But Miss Marple, gazing out of her window as dusk settled over the neat gardens and thatched roofs, remained thoughtful. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly prone to hasty judgment, and she had seen enough of it to know that the wrong man often bore the brunt of suspicion, while the true culprit sat quietly in the shadows. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she was certain the real murderer watched the village chatter with calm, or perhaps with concealed amusement. And if the truth were to be found, it would not come from bluster or quick conclusions, but from the small overlooked details, the ones that only patience and long observation revealed. The following morning brought with it a thin mist that clung stubbornly to the hedgerows and muffled the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead. Yet even under its damp blanket, the village was humming with the kind of gossip that only a murder, and in such a peculiar place as the library, could produce. The library itself, usually a quiet refuge for those in search of novels or parish records, was now firmly cordoned off by the authorities. A black car sat outside, and the constable paced about, seemingly overwhelmed by the sudden seriousness of his duty. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, a gathering had assembled. Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, was recounting for perhaps the 5th time how she had nearly gone to the library that very evening, but had been delayed by a missing pair of knitting needles. "Providence," she declared solemnly, as if the Almighty himself had intervened to spare her. Meanwhile, Miss Hartnell, with her usual sharpness, reminded everyone that the library had always carried a faintly suspicious air. Too many young people lingering about. Too much whispering in corners. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair by the window, appeared to be engaged with her knitting. Her needles clicked gently, the wool sliding easily through her fingers. She said very little, only the occasional polite murmur. Yet her blue eyes, sharp as ever, seemed to be taking in far more than the room realized. She noted how Mrs. Price's hands trembled when she spoke of Providence, how Miss Hartnell's eyes darted towards the vicar's wife, and how Mr. Barnes, the schoolmaster, sitting in the corner, seemed paler than usual, his thin lips pressed tightly together. The official investigation, meanwhile, was being directed by Inspector Craddock, a man with a kind face but a professional air of impatience. He had already identified a most likely suspect, the young Mr. Edgar Wilcox, a clerk from the nearby town, who had been seen leaving the library shortly before the discovery of the body. Wilcox was new to St. Mary Mead, and newcomers, as Miss Marple well knew, often bore the brunt of suspicion when scandal erupted in a tightly knit village. The inspector laid out his reasoning clearly. Wilcox had no firm alibi, had been borrowing books of a rather grim sort, detective novels with lurid titles, and, most damningly, had once argued with the librarian, Miss Elwood, over a late return fee. "There you are," he said firmly, as if the matter were already settled. Motive, temper, opportunity, it fits neatly. The villagers nodded with satisfaction. It was comforting in its way to pin the blame on an outsider. Gossip shifted rapidly, turning from hushed fears to the relish of dissecting Wilcox's character. Mrs. Price recalled that he had walked too quickly when she passed him in the lane. Miss Hartnell muttered that his coat was too dark for a respectable young man. The consensus was swiftly forming, as it so often did, around the notion that the problem had been neatly solved, but Miss Marple's needles clicked on. To her, Inspector Craddock's neat solution carried a certain flaw. A quarrel about library fines might irritate a man, yes, but to kill in such a way, it seemed disproportionate. Besides, she remembered quite clearly that Miss Elwood had always prided herself on being forgiving about small infractions, often waving aside pennies owed with a kindly smile. No, that sort of motive was a flimsy thing indeed. She thought, too, about the library itself. It was not only a place of books, but also a place of quiet corners, of overlooked shelves, of secrets whispered when no one else was listening. A murder committed, there was not the act of a man enraged about a fine. It was something deliberate, something chosen. The victim, Miss Elwood, had not been merely unfortunate. She had been silenced. That, Miss Marple thought, was a far more chilling matter. Later that day, as the inspector prepared to travel back to headquarters, with his suspicions firmly affixed to Mr. Wilcox, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage garden. She bent over the roses, ostensibly checking for aphids, and in that casual way of hers, she engaged the vicar's wife in gentle conversation. Mrs. Clement was an honest woman, kind but not always discreet, and it was not long before she revealed that Miss Elwood had been seen in the days before her death, speaking urgently with someone in the library's private reading room. The identity of that person remained uncertain, though Mrs. Clement thought it might have been Mr. Barnes, the schoolmaster. Miss Marple tucked this information away carefully. A private conversation, urgent and away from the public shelves, hinted at something quite different from an argument over pennies. It suggested secrets that might explain why someone would choose the silence of the library to commit a deadly act. That evening, as the mist deepened once more and lamps flickered in the village windows, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting and thought carefully about what she had heard. She was not yet certain, but she had a feeling, an instinct born of years of watching human nature unfold in all its predictable patterns, that the crime was far from solved. Edgar Wilcox might be an obvious suspect, but she had seen such cases before, and in her experience, the obvious suspect was very rarely the guilty one. The following days in St. Mary Mead were filled with uneasy glances and quiet whispers. Life in the village carried on. Bakers sold their loaves, gardeners tended their autumn roses, and the postman still whistled on his rounds, but under the surface, tension clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The library, draped in silence and locked against curious eyes, stood as a reminder of what had been lost. Miss Elwood had been no one's enemy, or so it had seemed, and yet she was dead. Miss Marple, with her gentle step and deceptively fragile appearance, went about her days as if nothing were amiss. She attended the Women's Institute meeting, stopped by Mrs. Price's shop for a skein of wool, and even paused in the lane to compliment the vicar's chrysanthemums. Yet behind her soft smile, her mind worked ceaselessly, turning over details, comparing them against the quiet patterns of human behavior she had catalogued over so many years. One afternoon, she took tea with Miss Hartnell, who was more eager than most to share theories. "Mark my words," Miss Hartnell said with a dramatic tilt of her head. "That Wilcox boy is guilty as sin. I saw him once, lingering near the library window after hours. Suspicious, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled politely, stirring her tea. "Suspicious, yes. And yet one wonders, why linger where one might be seen? A guilty man, in my experience, is more inclined to stay out of sight." Miss Hartnell sniffed, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She remembered something Mrs. Clement had let slip, that Miss Elwood had been speaking urgently with someone in the private reading room before her death. That small fact had settled in Miss Marple's thoughts like a burr, catching each time she considered the matter. Who, she wondered, had reason to seek privacy with a kindly librarian in such an unassuming place? The answer perhaps came sooner than she expected, for while the inspector busied himself with building a case against young Wilcox, Miss Marple decided to pay her own quiet visit to the library. The constable, young and flustered, was easy enough to distract with a question about his aunt's chilblains. Slipping past the threshold, Miss Marple found herself once again in the library's hushed atmosphere. Dust motes danced in the thin shaft of light from the tall windows, and the faint smell of ink and old wood lingered. It was not long before her sharp eyes settled on something overlooked. Near the small reading room where the rug was usually neat, she noticed a faint drag in the pile, as if something heavy had been shifted. And tucked beneath the edge of a chair leg, almost invisible, was a torn scrap of paper. She stooped, slowly as if her joints ached more than they did, and retrieved it. The writing was hurried, and the ink had smudged, but a few words were legible. Documents. Will destroy. Silence no longer. Miss Marple's brows drew together ever so slightly. Documents. Silence no longer. Such phrases hinted at the possibility of blackmail, or perhaps a secret long buried. She folded the scrap carefully into her handkerchief and left the library without fanfare, offering the constable a kindly word about the importance of warm socks. Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Clement for tea, and in her gentle, roundabout way, she asked after Miss Elwood's acquaintances. Who had reason to confide in her? Who might have secrets that required the discretion of a librarian, whose access to parish records and old letters was greater than most realized? Mrs. Clement, ever helpful, recalled that Mr. Barnes, the schoolmaster, had recently been poring over old parish registers with Miss Elwood's assistance. She also remembered that Mrs. Price's brother-in-law, once dismissed from the railway for theft, had been seen skulking near the library a fortnight past. Each name, each detail Miss Marple tucked away like pieces in a puzzle. She thought, too, of the librarian herself, gentle, discreet, and loyal. A woman like that might easily become the confidant of many, and if she had stumbled across something dangerous, it could well explain her fate. The next morning, Miss Marple took a turn about the village green, where she encountered Mr. Barnes. His thin face was drawn, and though he greeted her politely, she could not help but notice the faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted his spectacles. "So dreadful, Miss Marple," he murmured, his voice stiff. "Poor Miss Elwood. Such a shock to us all." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on him. "And yet one wonders, do shocks not affect us differently? Some grow pale, some tremble, some, quite curiously, grow very still." She let her words hang gently in the air, not accusatory, merely observational. Mr. Barnes gave a quick, tight smile and excused himself hastily. Miss Marple watched him go, her needles clicking quietly in her basket. She knew with the certainty born of experience that the schoolmaster was hiding something. Whether it was murder, however, remained to be seen. That evening, sitting alone by her fire, she unfolded the scrap of paper once more. The words whispered of secrets, documents, silence, destruction. They did not point to Wilcox, the inspector's favored suspect, but to something far deeper, something woven into the quiet fabric of village life. Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the rhythms of her knitting, that the truth was close at hand. But in St. Mary Mead, the truth was always hidden beneath layers of polite smiles and carefully chosen words. One had only to look closely enough to see it. The morning following Miss Marple's discoveries dawned grey and mist-laden, the kind of day when the village seemed to hold its breath. St. Mary Mead, usually full of quiet routines and familiar greetings, moved with a cautious stiffness, as though the memory of Harold Marchmont's death still lingered in the air like smoke. Even the children, whose games typically echoed across the green, stayed closer to home, glancing nervously toward the silent library. It was during this uneasy calm that the news arrived. The library, already the scene of tragedy, had been set alight in the small hours of the previous night. Smoke curled lazily from the roof, leaving black streaks across the once pristine stone. Fortunately, the fire had been small, more a scare than a full conflagration, and the local volunteer brigade had contained it before serious damage occurred. Yet the act itself spoke loudly. Someone had wished to destroy evidence, to erase something hidden within the library's aged walls. Villagers gathered outside, murmuring anxiously, their umbrellas dripping with the remnants of the morning mist. Mrs. Price Ridley wrung her hands and declared it a punishment from Providence. Though most suspected it was human malice rather than divine intervention, Mr. Abbott muttered that it could only be the work of someone desperate, someone determined that what Harold Marchmont had discovered, or intended to discover, must remain buried. Miss Marple arrived soon after, calm as ever, though she paused at the edge of the crowd to observe. She noted the expressions on familiar faces. Mr. Barnes, the schoolmaster, looked uneasy, his eyes flicking toward the scorched building. Clara Atwell's lips pressed tightly together, and Peter Carmichael fidgeted with his gloves. Even Mr. Cresswell, the librarian, whose nervousness had already drawn suspicion, appeared pale and subdued. Inside the library, the remnants of the fire lay scattered among the shelves. Pages curled, scorched at the edges. Smoke had blackened the ceiling and left a faint, acrid scent that clung stubbornly to the air. Miss Marple wandered slowly through the room, careful not to disturb anything further. Her gaze lingered on the pile of charred fragments that had once been part of the parish register, the very book Harold had clutched before his death. The torn scraps of paper she had found days before were still tucked safely in her handkerchief, and she compared them silently to the ruin now before her. The constable, who had arrived shortly after her, attempted to piece together the scene with brisk efficiency. "Someone's trying to cover their tracks," he said, shaking his head. "All that's left are ashes. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after." He frowned at Miss Marple. "And you, how did you come to be here so quickly?" "I walk through the village every morning," she replied gently. "The mist was favorable for observation, and I like to see how people behave when something unusual occurs." She paused, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Behavior, after all, is sometimes more revealing than evidence itself." Her words hung in the air, and the constable frowned again, uncertain whether he had been mildly reproached or simply enlightened. Later, she spoke quietly with Clara Atwell, who had lingered near the library door, shivering despite her coat. Clara admitted in hushed tones that Harold Marchmont had been attempting to locate a set of old documents, concerned about matters of inheritance and family history. He had confided only in Miss Elwood, it seemed, and it was knowledge he had kept hidden from everyone else. Fearing dispute or scandal, Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts threading through the clues she had gathered. The note at the fete, the torn parish register, and now the fire all pointed toward someone desperate to keep secrets buried. The sequence was deliberate. First Harold, then the attempt to destroy evidence, a pattern that could only have been planned by a mind attuned to concealment and careful manipulation. By the afternoon, speculation ran rampant. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted the act was the work of a newcomer, while others muttered about long-standing feuds within the village. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to the most obvious suspects, but to those whose reactions seemed out of proportion, whose fear carried a hint of recognition beyond simple shock. As dusk fell, she took her customary walk through the village lanes, thinking quietly. The fire had not just destroyed paper, it had revealed something far more significant. A murderer was at work, not merely willing to kill, but willing to manipulate the scene to hide the truth. And Miss Marple, who had always trusted the subtleties of human behavior over the apparent facts, knew that such a person would reveal themselves in the smallest of gestures, the quietest slip of speech. That evening, as the village tried to settle, there was a sense of foreboding. Even in the dim light of lamplighted windows, Miss Marple felt eyes upon her. Not hostile exactly, but watchful. The true culprit was close, possibly among those who appeared most serene, and she, as always, was ready to watch, to wait, and to unravel the secrets hidden beneath polite smiles and soft voices. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was subdued. The scare of the library fire had settled into a quiet tension, and the village moved through its routines with cautious eyes and hushed voices. Miss Marple, as usual, appeared unaffected, taking her morning walk among the hedgerows, her knitting basket swinging gently at her side. But her mind was anything but idle. She had seen enough in the last days to understand that the murder, the note, and the fire were connected, and that the threads would reveal themselves if watched carefully. Miss Marple decided it was time for a subtle test, one that would give her insight into the reactions of those closest to the events. She invited the principal villagers to tea at her cottage, including Mr. Barnes, Mrs. Price Ridley, Clara Atwell, Peter Carmichael, and even the nervous Mr. Cresswell. Her invitations were delivered with her usual gentleness, without indication of the purpose behind the gathering. The visitors arrived, chatting politely about the weather and recent village affairs. Miss Marple, ever gracious, offered them tea and biscuits, observing their movements with careful attention. She made small, seemingly innocuous remarks, weaving her words with mild suggestion, drawing out snippets of conversation and noticing reactions, however subtle. "It is unfortunate about poor Harold," she began casually, pouring tea for Clara. One would think the library, full of such quiet, would be a safe place. Yet someone determined can turn any sanctuary into danger, can't they? She smiled gently, encouraging a murmur of agreement. Clara's hands tightened around her cup. Yes, yes, of course, she said, her voice a little too high. Peter Carmichael at her side placed a calming hand on her arm, though he avoided looking at the others. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Mr. Barnes. He shifted in his chair, glancing down at the floor. "It's hard to think anyone from our peaceful village could do such a thing," he muttered, his voice low. "And yet, Mr. Barnes," Miss Marple continued softly, "sometimes those we least suspect are capable of surprising acts. Even a well-ordered life may conceal certain necessities." She paused, letting the words hang, allowing the group to fill in the blanks themselves. Mr. Cresswell, who had already borne suspicion, looked stricken. He straightened, stammering a reply about his dedication to the library and his shock at the fire. Miss Marple made no move to press him further. She had already noted the look in his eyes, the particular fear of someone caught unawares, not of guilt over murder. As the tea progressed, she turned her attention to Mrs. Price Ridley. "And you, my dear," she said gently, "what do you think drives someone to conceal what others ought to know? Do you imagine it is fear? Or perhaps necessity?" Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated, her face reddening. "I suppose fear, mostly," she murmured. Glancing toward the door as if it might offer escape from observation, Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, fear can make people do strange things. But necessity is a stronger motivator than mere fright, don't you think?" Her eyes flicked imperceptibly toward Mr. Barnes again, noting the slight stiffening of his posture. It was Clara who gave the most telling reaction. When Miss Marple casually mentioned that some secrets were hidden in the library's registers and archives, Clara's face paled further, and she dropped her teacup into the saucer with a sharp clink. Peter quickly steadied it, but the slip revealed far more than words could. Miss Marple observed quietly, cataloguing the subtle expressions, the small hesitations, the tightening of fists or lips. Each reaction, though seemingly unremarkable, was a piece of the puzzle. She did not ask direct questions about the murder or the note. She allowed the villagers to speak freely on related matters, observing how the past, the fire, and Harold Marchmont's fate affected them internally. By the end of the visit, she had assembled an impression of each person. Some were genuinely shocked, some anxious but innocent, and some, she thought, concealing much more than they wished to reveal. Mr. Barnes, in particular, had shown tiny but undeniable signs of recognition when the library's secrets were mentioned. Clara, while frightened, seemed unaware of the implications of her own reactions, and Cresswell, though nervous, revealed nothing of real consequence. Miss Marple poured herself a quiet cup of tea after the visitors departed, sitting by the fire and considering the evidence of human behavior laid before her. The key, as she had always known, was not in books nor in obvious clues, but in the subtle shifts in manner and expression, the reactions that betrayed guilt or complicity. She would need to set one more subtle test, a final gentle prod, to see the true murderer reveal themselves. And in St. Mary Mead, as the sun sank behind the hedgerows and the last lamplights flickered on, the murderer remained quietly confident, oblivious, that their smallest gestures had already been noted by the keen eyes of Miss Jane Marple. The evening of Miss Marple's final gathering arrived with a gentle chill in the air, the sky over St. Mary Mead streaked with the soft purples and golds of sunset. The village seemed unusually still, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something unsaid. Miss Marple had invited the villagers to her cottage once more, ostensibly for a quiet social tea, but her mind was already engaged in the delicate work of her final test. She had arranged the seating carefully, positioning the individuals whose reactions she wished to observe so that they would interact subtly. Mr. Barnes sat near the fireplace, eyes darting occasionally to the shelves lined with Miss Marple's neatly arranged books. Clara Atwell and Peter Carmichael were near one another, sharing nervous whispers, while Mr. Cresswell occupied a chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the garden. Miss Marple began with gentle conversation, discussing the autumn flowers in the village, the upcoming parish fair, and local anecdotes, each comment carefully crafted to evoke recognition without accusation. Then, almost casually, She drew attention to a small pile of old parish records she had just discovered in her own collection. "Oh, I was just glancing through some old documents," she said softly, holding a faded register with a gentle air of curiosity. "One can find the strangest things hidden among these pages. Old debts, family disputes, matters that people often wish would remain private." Her words had the desired effect. Mr. Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his teacup. Clara's lips parted in a startled expression, and even Peter's hand twitched as he instinctively steadied hers. Mr. Cresswell, however, maintained his composure, though his eyes briefly flicked toward the register. "Curious, isn't it," Miss Marple continued, "how someone might go to great lengths to prevent certain facts from seeing the light of day? One wonders how far people would go to ensure that secrets remain hidden." Her tone was mild, but each word was carefully weighted. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat. I wouldn't presume to interfere with anyone's documents," he said, his voice slightly high-pitched, betraying tension he could not conceal. Miss Marple's eyes softened with a hint of understanding. Of course. We all wish to do what is right, and yet sometimes fear or necessity compels. Actions one might otherwise avoid." The subtle implication had its effect. Mr. Barnes's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. A bead of sweat shone on his brow. Miss Marple's gaze rested on him for a heartbeat longer than polite, then moved away as if casually distracted by a passing thought. "Some things," she said, rising to fetch another plate of biscuits, "cannot remain hidden no matter how careful one might be. Sooner or later truth surfaces, sometimes through accident, sometimes through the vigilance of a keen observer." At that moment, a small sigh escaped Mr. Barnes. It was almost imperceptible, but to Miss Marple it was a confession in miniature, the reaction of someone caught in the web of their own concealment. She paused, knitting her brow subtly as she turned to the others. "You see," she said gently, sitting back down, "the library was more than a place for books. It held records, old letters, and documents that some would prefer remained unseen. Poor Harold Marchmont, in his curiosity or concern, discovered something someone wished to suppress. That is why he met with misfortune." Her words caused a ripple of murmurs among the group. Clara gasped softly, and Peter gripped her hand a little tighter. Mr. Cresswell's face remained calm, but Miss Marple had already judged him innocent of the actual crime. It was the subtle signs in Mr. Barnes, the tightening jaw, the averted eyes, the fidgeting fingers, that told the story. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm, "that the person who ended Harold's life and later attempted to destroy the evidence in the library fire, it did so to prevent certain documents from coming to light. These documents, I understand, concerned family matters long concealed, matters that Mr. Barnes, in his capacity as schoolmaster and keeper of local history, had every reason to protect personally." Mr. Barnes rose abruptly, color draining from his face. "Miss Marple, you can't—" She raised a calming hand. "I do not accuse without reason. I have observed, I have listened, and I have noted the responses of those involved. It is behavior, small gestures, and inconsistencies that have led me here. The clue that seemed insignificant, the slight drag in the reading room rug, the torn scrap of paper, has told its own story. You, Mr. Barnes, sought to conceal the truth. You acted in fear that your secrets would be revealed, and in doing so, caused the death of Harold Marchmont." Silence fell across the room. Mr. Barnes, realizing the inevitability of exposure, sank back into his chair, his face a mask of guilt and resignation. The other villagers looked on with shock, their curiosity and fear mingling in equal measure. The constable arrived shortly afterward, having been summoned discreetly by Miss Marple. He listened to her account, then nodded grimly, noting the evidence of behavior and the additional clues she had uncovered. With careful attention, he led Mr. Barnes away, and the village would learn in time the full extent of his deception and the lengths he had gone to protect his secrets. Miss Marple, sitting back in her chair, resumed her knitting. Outside, the last rays of sunset faded behind the hedgerows, and St. Mary Mead, shaken but slowly returning to normal, felt the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed. She reflected, as she always did, on the predictable nature of human behavior, the way fear, greed, and pride often leave traces visible to the patient observer. And in the gentle flicker of the firelight, she felt that once again, justice had quietly taken its course. The morning after Mr. Barnes's arrest arrived quietly over St. Mary Mead. The village, still recovering from the shock of the revelation, moved through its familiar routines, though conversations were now tinged with a lingering awareness that secrets once uncovered could reshape lives. The library, scarred by fire and shadowed by memory, remained closed to the public, a solemn reminder of the events that had shaken the village so deeply. Miss Marple walked along the familiar lanes, her basket of knitting swinging lightly at her side. She passed the vicarage, the bakery, and the small shops, nodding politely to the villagers who looked at her with a mixture of respect and quiet gratitude. The knowledge that the truth had been revealed had brought relief, though it did not erase the unease left in its wake. Some villagers whispered that the murder and the attempted destruction of the library's records had exposed long-buried tensions they had barely suspected. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement prepared a modest tea, inviting Miss Marple to sit with her and share a moment of quiet reflection. "It is all over, I suppose," Mrs. Clement said softly, pouring the tea. "And yet it feels different. The village has changed," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, dear. People change when they see how easily fear and secrecy can lead to tragedy. Yet life will continue. Gardens will still bloom, children will still play, and in time the village will find its rhythm once more. But the memory remains, and with it, lessons about human nature that one cannot forget." The library, though still closed, had become a subject of careful discussion among the villagers. Some expressed regret that the records had been partially destroyed. Others were more concerned with the scandal of the murder itself. The truth about Mr. Barnes had settled matters in one sense, yet it also reminded everyone that appearances were often deceiving, and that the quietest corners of life could conceal the deepest intrigues. Clara Atwill, recovering from the shock of the past days, expressed her gratitude to Miss Marple. "If it had not been for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I do not know how we could have understood what happened. We would have accepted Wilcox's guilt, and the true story would have remained hidden." Miss Marple smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand over Clara's. "It is always easy to point to the obvious, but people are rarely as they seem at first glance. One must listen, observe, and note the small things, gestures, hesitations, slips of the tongue. Those details, while subtle, often carry the greatest weight." In the days that followed, Mr. Barnes was taken to face the legal consequences of his actions. The villagers, though saddened by the events, felt a measure of closure. The fire had destroyed some records, but enough remained to explain Harold Marchmont's investigations and the motive behind the crime. The young man's curiosity, once tragically fatal, had not been in vain, for his discovery had ultimately brought the truth to light. Miss Marple returned to her quiet routines, tending her garden, visiting neighbors, and engaging in her knitting. Yet even as she went about these ordinary tasks, she remained vigilant in thought, reflecting on the patterns of human behavior that had revealed the murderer. She considered how fear and the desire to protect oneself could drive otherwise respectable people to desperate acts. And she thought of Harold Marchmont, whose curiosity had cost him his life, yet had illuminated the truth for all. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to breathe a little easier. Lamps glimmered in the windows, the air carried the soft scent of autumn leaves, and a sense of calm returned. Miss Marple, sitting by the fire with her knitting in hand, allowed herself a small smile. She had witnessed the fragility of human nature, the consequences of secrets and deception, and yet she remained convinced that careful observation, patience, and understanding could bring light to even the darkest of deeds. The village had endured its trial, and though the memory of the haunted library and the tragedy within its walls would linger, life in St. Mary Mead would continue, quietly, gently, with the knowledge that justice, subtle and thorough, had been served.